opportunities and challenges across Australia and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. COVID-19 has unleashed an unprecedented set of new challenges, as well as a chance for a global and regional reset. This launch event, as part of the Next Gen Policy Change Week of events, seeks to frame the big social and policy issues in Australia and our region. It also seeks to set the agenda and then for the next decade of action on the SDGs and much more. We will be tonight drawing on policy and research experts as well as young changemakers across the region to discuss what are the big issues we're currently facing and where do we focus our energy on for the next coming decade. A bit about me, I'm co-founder of Social Good Outpost, researcher at Griffith University and the curator of this speaker series. This speaker series was started by Social Good Outpost, an Australian design and strategy studio working across Australia and Asia to help communities increase their impact in 2019. It has since involved over 50,000 events, working with just over 4,000 individuals across Southeast Asia. We exist because we believe that young people are the key to some of the biggest issues out there, and that we really need to work together and collaborate for all of our region's success. We try to be both a platform to promote young voices in international affairs, as well as to provide the wider community with an opportunity to learn from and collaborate with intergenerational and cross-cultural communities. We're very lucky to have collaborated tonight with two very important organisations in the generation of this event and this week, the Next Gen Policy Change Week of events. Firstly, the Australia-ASEAN Council, launched in 2015, exists to generate opportunities for Australian business, education, science, innovation and the arts to work with partners across Southeast Asia. Griffith University is also one of our core partners in delivering these events. We partnered up in the lead up to the Business Innovation and Improvement in Government Conference, which is being held from the 16th to the 17th of February, to bring an intergenerational and innovative way to look at our biggest problems out there in the region and here in Australia. Why? Because as a values-led university, Griffith has been at the forefront of research, learning and teaching around some of the big business, government, environmental and social issues from our century and beyond. We're incredibly honoured to have partnered with the Policy Innovation Hub, a platform to connect leading researchers with government to solve complex problems, as well as Griffith Business School to hold this series. But first, we're here to share, inspire our communities, learn and collaborate. In the spirit of this storytelling, I'd like to acknowledge the many millennia of such sharing that has gone before us, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging of the lands in which I gather here in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Yagara people, as well as acknowledge the traditional owners of those communities from which we are all gathered here today, whether in Australia or across Southeast Asia and the world. We have a role to play in our communities in connecting with our history, as well as forging our future together. In that light, 2 points for tonight. So firstly, you will notice that you have a Q&A function on this chat forum, the webinar here tonight. You can find it down the bottom of Zoom panel if you're watching through Zoom. If you're on Facebook Live, you can also ask questions, write comments on our Facebook Live platform too. That's the Young Entrepreneurs and Leaders Speaker Series. You'll also notice that there's a chat function. So please feel free to use these functions to get your message out there to our panelists tonight and to make to ask questions when we get to our open Q&A. But secondly, I would love to welcome firstly Amelia Long, the Second Secretary at the Australian Mission to ASEAN, to say a few words to kick us off. Amelia, I'm going to give you a little brief intro here, although I know that your history goes way beyond what I can tell just quickly. But prior to joining the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2017, Amelia was a researcher at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where she focused on defence and security issues in Southeast Asia. She was also an editor of The Strategist. She has previously worked at the Altruist Foundation in West Java and as a communications officer at the ACT chapter of the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association. Amelia, we are so thrilled to have you here tonight and would love you to kick off our events and frame what are the big issues for Australia and ASEAN in our region in this decade coming ahead.
Thank you so much, Elise. And thank you so much to everyone for tuning in for this wonderful event. It is such a great opportunity to be providing opening remarks, and it is really wonderful for me to be joining a passionate group of young people seeking to explore the big issues that Southeast Asia is facing and will continue to face over the next decade. Elise has already introduced me, so I don't need to go into that too much. I'm currently the second secretary at Australia's mission to ASEAN, and I'm coming to you live from Jakarta. My remarks today will have three main parts. First, I'm going to outline why, from the ASEAN mission's perspective, Southeast Asia and ASEAN are important to Australia. Second, I'll frame some of the challenges that the region faces and what role that we can play. And third, I'm going to discuss why collaboration, networks, and partnerships are more important in 2021 than ever before. So to kick things off, Southeast Asia is incredibly important to Australia. To give this statement some context, I'll give you a few quick statistics. As a bloc, ASEAN has a population of 630 million people and accounts for the world's largest youth population. Also, as a bloc, it can be considered Australia's second largest trading partner, with two-way trade valued at $124 billion in the 2018-19 financial year, which is around 14% of Australia's total trade. Our deep and long-standing people-to-people links are also a key asset in the relationship. I don't need to explain to this particular cohort the importance to Australia of the students from across Southeast Asia that come to study at Australian universities and schools, nor the fantastic work of the new Colombo Scholars or Australia Awards recipients. These programs ensure that the next generation of leader, diplomat, scholar, and entrepreneur will take up the mantle with a stronger understanding of the world that we live in and with a network of friends and colleagues from across the region to face it with. Geographically, Southeast Asia is our neighbourhood, it's our home, and it's a region that's vital for Australia's security. And of course, Southeast Asia and ASEAN sit at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific. It's right there geographically, sitting between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and it's also right there politically and strategically. The Indo-Pacific frames the way that Australia thinks about our region. It frames much of our foreign policy. It's our home, it's where we live. It's the region that has been the engine room for global growth over the last 2 decades, and it's where we see great opportunity for the future. It's also the region in which Australia can have the most meaningful impact, and we see ASEAN as sitting at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN has made an extraordinary contribution to Southeast Asia's transformation from poverty and conflict to peace and stability by fostering cooperation and establishing habits of dialogue over the past 50 years. It's become the central rule and norm-setting body for the region. And in that time, it has become the region's strategic convener through forums like the East Asia Summit, which brings together all 10 Southeast Asian nations, as well as the US, China, India, Japan, Russia, New Zealand, South Korea, and of course, Australia. As ASEAN's first dialogue partner, Australia has long recognised and valued the role of a strong and cohesive ASEAN in maintaining peace, stability, and prosperity in our shared region. We're an active participant in ASEAN's forums, engaging in debates, working together on thematic statements on the region's big ticket issues, and hosting workshops and discussions that help shape and implement these norms and improve cooperation and capacity. We cooperate to combat challenges and to maximise opportunities, which leads me to the second part of my talk, challenges and opportunities. Now, of course, the Indo-Pacific region is facing major challenges. To name just a few, pressure on rules, norms, and institutions is more acute, tensions over territorial claims are growing, economic coercion is increasingly employed as a tool of statecraft, cyber attacks are growing in frequency and sophistication, disinformation is being used to manipulate free societies, the Indo-Pacific has become the epicenter of strategic competition, and overshadowing all of this is COVID-19. Australia sees ASEAN as playing a central role in addressing the challenges facing the region through its role in fostering dialogue and, as I mentioned earlier, in setting regional rules and norms. As the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister consistently reaffirm, ASEAN lays at the heart of Australia's vision for a stable, resilient, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. In 2019, Indonesia led, with Thailand's support as ASEAN chair at the time, development of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The Outlook sets out ASEAN's vision for a region that is rules-based, promotes open markets and ASEAN centrality, and for cooperation with partners across 4 key areas: maritime, connectivity, the Sustainable Development Goals, and broader economic development. Its principles are consistent with those that underpin Australia's own vision for the Indo-Pacific, a region of stable, prosperous, and sovereign states that cooperate on shared interests and are resilient to coercion. Australia believes the Outlook and its principles should guide interaction between states in the region, including during the time of COVID-19, which brings me to my next point. COVID-19 has now taken out the title of Indo-Pacific's biggest challenge. Many Indo-Pacific countries have had some success in containing the pandemic, but COVID-19 is continuing to cause substantial loss of life and to undermine hard-won development gains. It's pushed 150 million people back into extreme poverty. It also makes countries more vulnerable to other risks, such as natural disasters and financial instability. COVID-19 has reinforced that Australia's security and prosperity is tied to that of the wider Indo-Pacific. The region's ability to rebound from the pandemic will be pivotal for Australia's economic recovery. Just as Southeast Asia's prosperity is our prosperity, Southeast Asia's recovery is our recovery. Last year, Australia announced a significant package of support for Southeast Asian countries through our Partnerships for Recovery framework. This funding includes support for ASEAN to respond to the health challenges posed by COVID-19 and support for ASEAN's economic recovery. Equitable access to safe, effective, and affordable COVID-19 vaccines will be the central factor for our recovery. Australia is collaborating with partners to ensure that there are safe vaccines that are made available to everyone across our region. Combating the mental health issues that have resulted from COVID-19 too will be a big focus for the year ahead. Brunei, ASEAN's current chair, has made "We Care, We Prepare, We Prosper" its theme for 2021. The first part of this, caring, goes directly to seeking to look after those who have been affected by the ramifications of COVID-19. ASEAN has a vital role to play in our region's response to the pandemic, charting a course for economic recovery and shaping the post-crisis regional order. It's in our interests to work together with our neighbours and our friends in ASEAN to address all of the problems for the region that COVID has created. And this brings me to my final point on collaboration. People-to-people relations are an incredibly important part of everything that we do. It's the glue that brings countries together. Research shows that the more people from different countries understand and are comfortable with a range of cultures, beliefs, and practices, the more enduring the relationship between those countries becomes. So when people study together, work together, and holiday in each other's countries, levels of trust and understanding are usually higher. 2020 has, of course, challenged this a bit. But a big thing that I've learned since starting work at the Australian mission to ASEAN is that people-to-people links don't necessarily need to be built in person. I've been in my current job for about 6 months now, during which I've been involved in 1 foreign ministerial meeting, 1 ASEAN Australia Leaders Summit, 1 East Asia Summit, and a lot of virtual negotiations. And I've done all of that from the desk in the spare bedroom in my apartment. Last year's virtual ASEAN Summit season was a historic first, with leaders patching in to deliver their interventions to online meeting rooms from across the region. Rather than meeting on stage in Hanoi for a signature ASEAN handshake, 18 world leaders appeared in a Brady Bunch-style rectangles in the screens from across the globe. That so many officials were able to meet with the shared goal of discussing the most important strategic issues facing the region at this important time in history highlights the gravitas behind ASEAN's convening power. As our formal interactions have gone digital, so too have our informal ones. I haven't been able to meet any of my ASEAN counterparts in person, owing to how widespread COVID-19 is here in Jakarta. To get around that, we've been sending packages of lamingtons around to colleagues from other missions and asking for virtual coffee introductions. This has been a great way for us to all keep in touch, to advance Australia's interests, to sneak in a bit of therapeutic ISO baking, and to showcase Australian culture to other diplomats. Lamington diplomacy, as we're calling it, has taken off here. Virtual morning teas have become virtual Friday night drinks run by other missions. And as soon as I can, I'm really looking forward to being able to meet my counterparts in person. It's incredibly important that we're able to gather virtually for events like today's, to learn from each other, to build networks, and to brainstorm solutions for an increasingly challenging global environment. A silver lining of the last year has been that events that would normally take place in person have been able to take place online, bringing together a more diverse range of participants than you'd usually be able to gather in one geographic location. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the stellar lineup of panelists, Pin Xiu, Ben and Susan, and thank you all again for engaging with and collaborating on a bright future for the region.
Thanks so much, Amelia. And wow, I love the idea of Lamington diplomacy. I mean, I have to say, having been through this whole process of running events all across the region, I think I did 49 in person before COVID hit. And then since then, about 12 or so digitally. I think actually digitally does work. It's not the same, but I am looking forward to taking up Lamington diplomacy in the future. Right now, though, we have come to the, one of those kind of really key moments of the night, which is where I get to introduce everyone to our brilliant panelists. Tonight, we are super, super honoured to be joined by three incredible people. We have, firstly, the Director of the Policy Innovation Hub here at Griffith University, Professor Sue Harris-Rimmer. We have an amazing gold Paralympic medalist, plus youngest ever at the time, nominated Member of Parliament in Singapore, Yip Pin Xiu. And we also have the wonderful Ben Abbatangelo, who doesn't need any other introduction than just that. Tonight, all the speakers have been involved in advocacy, policy, or social change to some degree, either in Australia or in their region. To start with, I really wanted to throw it out there to our speakers and ask, how did you get to where you got to today? What is it that you spend most of your time working on? And what sparked your interest in policy change to begin with? I'm going to hand over now to Pin Xiu. Can you take away the stage for me?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here today. So, how I started doing this was, it started from swimming. So to explain a bit more about myself, I have a disability called Charcot-Marie-Tooth, which is some form of muscle degeneration. So when I was younger, swimming was really more of a family activity for me, where my brothers would swim and then I would just play at the baby pool. So I really, really enjoyed swimming. It was a passion. And then I eventually started swimming competitively when I was 11. And then I went to the Paralympics when I was 16. And then I've been there every 4 years till last year, Tokyo got disrupted. But I hope to be going sometime later this year. Right. So as part of swimming and then winning achievements, I was kind of thrown into this spotlight where in Singapore, there wasn't a lot of media representation when it came to people with disabilities. So I guess I was thrown into the spotlight at an early age because I was different. I had brought honor and glory to Singapore. So that was when I started to speak up a bit more about people with disabilities, about sports, and that is how I'm here today. Yep.
Thanks so much, Pin Xiu. And I mean, we're super keen to hear a little bit more about that later, but we actually have another former sportsman on our panel. And I really want to hear from you too, Ben, because you've been in the world of professional athletes, you've been in the world of social change and being really in-depth and involved in your community. What's this process been like for you? What are you spending your time doing right now? And what even sparked your interest in policy or social change to begin with?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. And it's pretty cool to be around a group of rock star women. So thanks for allowing me to share the stage with each of you. I think the interesting question and mulling on this, the starting point for me, although I didn't know it at the time, is probably when I was in the womb. of my mother. Being born into the world as an Aboriginal person, and as I think of that more broadly, is somewhat, I think, an act of sovereignty or political activism in itself when we think about, the pretty damning history that Aboriginal people have been subjugated to here in Australia. So I think, I didn't know that at the time, but as I was growing up, I started to realize that there was some differences, and that it wasn't necessarily the same playing field. We weren't all starting at the same place. So, I think in my getting thrusted into professional sport at a pretty young age, it was quite a monumental moment for myself. I left mainstream education at a pretty young age, and then fell into sport probably a few years too early. So being in a high performance environment and around a lot of people that you think, the bee's knees is a good thing and a bad thing. You realize that some of them are really exceptional, and then some of them are not so exceptional, and it's maybe a little bit more of a veneer than a truth. So finishing sport, I then landed in the boardroom at a very young age, and was very fortunate to be doing some work that I really cared about, but also importantly was able to take me around the world. So I could have days where I was in juvenile justice centres and then in the Prime Minister's office, to then being on a plane to do stuff with the granddaughters of the Mandelas in South Africa, to being in New York, working with media conglomerates. So I think my journey is a little bit different, where I've maybe, found a niche, had a lot of practical experiences. And now I'm at the point of time where I think I need to maybe slow down and underpin those practical experiences with a little bit more theory. That's a little bit of an insight into me.
And starting so young, I mean, that's one of the things that really amazes me. You really, and for both of you, Pin Xiu and Ben, I guess being in that limelight from such an early age and kind of having the attention, I mean, it does give you a certain amount of power and ability to see the room to make change and perhaps have people listen to you. But I can completely understand, that want to, well, okay, now that I am here, where do I go with it? How do I make this truly what it can be?
Yeah, and I think just on that, it's interesting to try and maintain some of that naivety. As we get older, we get more no's, we understand diplomacy, nuance. There's a bunch of, we get lost in the complexity at times. So, I'm doing my best, and I'm sure Pin Xiu is as well, to maintain that naivety, but also try and underpin it with a little bit of scar tissue, a little bit of reason, to hopefully find the best methods to, incite the right levels of change at the right time. So, yeah.
I love that. I often hear from entrepreneurs or leaders, if they had have known more before they started on their mission of social change, they might not have done it. So having that form of naivety can be a real confidence boost. But Sue, I want to go to you now too. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got here. What drives you? Because you have such myriad passions and some really interesting ones. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from your perspective.
Sure, and I guess I'm the token old person on the panel. So I'm just amazed at my colleagues and what they've accomplished so far. It's extraordinary. I come from a very small rural town in the middle of pretty much nowhere in central West New South Wales called Coonabarabran. And so amazingly, I was always very interested in issues of justice, but I was a very unlikely person to even finish high school, let alone go to university. But I was always attracted to justice issues, particularly in my town. There were a lot of issues around the rights of Indigenous Australians. There were a lot of issues around domestic violence, and I guess lack of access to healthcare and all kinds of issues related to poverty. And famously for me, I know not everyone can say this, but I had a big journey when David Bowie shot the film clip Let's Dance in my hometown when I was 11 years old. And he said Coonabarabran was a very racist place. And, I was an evidence-based kid even back then, and I saw it. I finally saw it properly for the first time. It was, it was a shock, but I'm very grateful to have been shocked like that at an early age and started opening my eyes to the outcomes for my colleagues at school who were exactly the same as me and as smart as me and everything the same as me except for the colour of their skin, and kind of some of the outcomes they had and still have. So I suppose I was interested, when you're in those kinds of towns and you grow up in those kinds of towns, there's a certain amount of isolation from the world. So I guess you would say I had a lot of naivete as well. I still got very excited by places like Brisbane, right up until my early 20s. Brisbane's very exciting to me. So Southeast Asia blew my mind, of course, when I finally got to travel around the region. But it also made me realise there's so many issues that, you know, I'd grown up with, a lot of domestic issues around gender equality, issues around racism, issues around poverty and access to just the basic needs of life in order to have a life of dignity. So I was always very interested in studying law, but also drama. So I have I have a degree in drama as well, and I was always extremely interested in this idea of you know, how do we promote justice, especially when societies are in transition. My first job was with UNHCR, which is the High Commissioner for Refugees, my first big job. So I've always been interested in what happens to people who are forcibly displaced, because that was something I'd grown up with. A lot of Indigenous Australians that I grew up with had been forcibly displaced and on reservations and things around Moree and places like that. So that was something that was very important to me. And I was also very interested in the world of aid and international development. So I was also working for an organisation called the Australian Council for International Development, which is the peak body for all the Australian aid agencies. So I was very interested in this kind of, I worked as an aid worker. It was very hard, mainly in Timor and in Kenya, on the Somali-Kenya border. And then I was more interested in the kind of structural issues around the delivery of aid. I just feel like that work is, for me, just, why would you not work on things like that? The concept of being a corporate lawyer did not appeal to me. So I guess it's not a sense of virtue, it's a sense of what's hard, what's complicated, what's difficult, what needs fixing. So I think for a lot of people, you can't let where you were born determine where you end up. You've got to just think to yourself, like, if this poor as a church mouse girl from Coonabarabran can do things in the kind of world of international relations, certainly anybody can. And I tell everybody I meet that I'm from Coonabarabran, and so that they know that you don't have to be from certain types of backgrounds to have certain types of jobs. It would have been unimaginable to me that you could become a human rights law professor from a place like Coonabarabran. You can, it's just a lot harder, but you can. So I think you've got to, you know, wear your passion with pride, and learn and wear your failings with pride too. You know, I'm still on a journey when it comes to being a human rights advocate. You're always unlearning and learning new things about the way you see the world. So just being honest and learning, you know, you've never got a handle on injustice in this world. Every time you think you know what it looks like, it changes on you. So yeah, just keep learning and keep asking questions, and treat everybody you meet, you know, with extreme dignity to hear their story.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. And I think that's such a good way to kind of kick this off, because when we are talking about inevitably some of the challenges that the region is facing, as well as the opportunities, it is important that we recognize how difficult these things are. You know, if they weren't difficult, we wouldn't have such difficult, you know, have so many conversations around them. It wouldn't be so controversial. We wouldn't, you know, be struggling so much to come up with the right pathway. I mean, we know that sometimes collaborating with our own family can be hard enough, let alone, you know, people in our region or our local community or hometown. So it's yeah, it's a really good point. And I want to drill in a little bit further, and I'm actually going to bounce back to Pin Xiu, because we're here to talk specifically about the big issues and opportunities. what I want to know is kind of after this year that was 2020 and 2021's not looking that much better, what were some of the major social or kind of policy issues that you experienced in your local community? And yeah, what's that whole process been like for you?
I think that the top three issues that we've noticed that has come up last year was really about jobs and employment, mental health, as well as inclusivity. So I especially like to work in the inclusivity portion of things, and I think it's normal. It's not right, but it's normal that many times people don't notice what they don't need. So, for example, it could just be as simple as the infrastructure of a building. If I'm not on a wheelchair, if I don't have a baby stroller, if somebody's not on a motorized vehicle, they wouldn't realize that there are certain steps in front of a building, whereas somebody else who needs it will realize. So I think at the end of the day, it's really getting people to think for others, have a bit more empathy, and be in the shoes of others, so that I think as long as once we think for each other, and the world will be a better place.
Yeah, completely. And with COVID, I suppose that's been even more difficult in some instances, you know, to get access to basic facilities, the help that you need. Has that been something that you've come across in your experience in this last, 12 months?
Yes, especially during COVID, because when something happens, everybody just wants to stop it as quickly as possible, but they don't understand that some certain group of people need a bit more help. So, for example, when we were having our circuit breaker for 2 months, it's similar to a lockdown. Like, a lot of things were stopped and only essential services were allowed. However, it didn't really come to mind that some people might be on ventilators and unable to wear mask, or some people might require a bit more physio or care at home. But then all of these services were suspended. So it took a while for these services to restart again. But as some people can have can degenerate really quickly, it was like many wasted weeks of having to cope and themselves, or just being at home, which was actually really sad.
Yeah, and quite scary too, I imagine. And I think, even in Australia, we certainly had issues around, well, how do you even communicate the necessary requirements and then make kind of the right amount of supports to be able to ensure that everyone has access to actually take part in the safety instructions as required and all of those other things. Like, there isn't one message doesn't fit all, and one solution doesn't fit all in this case. So yeah, I can really see that. Ben, for you, this last year reflecting, and I know that this has been a period of change for yourself regardless, what have you seen as being some of the big issues for yourself or for the communities in which you work?
Yeah. Well, I think the nature of crises, right, is that it exposes our fragilities, and it really illuminates the things that we've perhaps walked past, when things are seemingly normal, things are seemingly moving, and everyone seems to be okay. So I'm just really interested in this moment, that we can not try and, just revert back to whatever normal was, because normal clearly wasn't working for the majority of people. And that we actually just hang in this time of tension, for as long as we possibly can, to prolong that tension. And hopefully off the back of that, be able to unlock some really practical solutions to the plethora of challenges that we are facing. So I'd also think for anyone watching this, my lens has been on how do we ensure that the groups of people that were already experiencing inequity before the crises aren't pushed into more inequality at the back end of this. So whatever policy design that we're doing, whatever strategies that we're implementing, maybe to Pin Xiu's point, how do we flip this modus operandi upside down and ensure that we're actually covering for those that are, those that are struggling the most, rather than catering to those that already have everything. So, the intervention place is fascinating, and it's a really good chance, I think, for any change makers, for anyone that cares about the world that we live in and the legacy that we're going to leave behind, to actually get in the game as we strip ourselves, virtually bare and prepare ourselves to rebuild and put a new outfit on. It's a good chance to, put the building blocks in place so that this new normal really is a new normal, and it's just not a reflex back to the pre-existing status quo.
That's such a good point. I mean, even just in the last 2 weeks, we've had kind of the new Vietnamese government in place. And we know that gender inequalities was certainly a thing, not just in Vietnam, but across our region, across Australia. Now, I believe the Politburo in Vietnam has 1 woman out of 17, and we're starting to see a little bit of a regression when it comes to some of those hard-won progress. I mean, I know that through COVID, for instance, we are seeing a bit of a trend towards strongman kind of leadership. But on the other hand, we're also seeing some interesting cases of the reverse. I mean, that's certainly, some of those inequities that, not too keen to revisit or regress to, but seem to be rising to the fore again.
Yeah, and I think just on that as well, really quickly, it makes total sense to have people that reflect the environment that you live in at the helm. If you look around your workplace and it doesn't reflect the environment that you've incepted to serve, or the people that you're responsible for providing services to, then that's probably the best place to change. The best place to start is ensuring that whoever's holding the pen, is a reflection of that designated community that you're trying to serve.
Yeah, completely. So I know that you've done a lot of work in this space, but for you, I guess you've been working across gender equality, climate change, human rights law, the kind of full spectrum. For 2020, what were some of the big issues that rose to the fore for you? And what are you kind of concerned about when you think about some of those issues? Or
A lot of the time I was just
and I think
privileged.
Sorry.
There we go. I'm
Yep.
louder now. A lot of the time I was just checking my privilege, just so grateful that I was in a home that was safe, and trying to think about how it was playing out for people around the world, I suppose. So I spent a lot of time kind of just trying to understand how these inequities were unfolding. My immediate priority was around domestic violence, so I kind of was reasonably certain that as soon as we instituted lockdowns, there'd be quite a large spike in domestic violence, not just in Australia, but around our region. And there certainly was. I was worried about borders slamming shut, what that would mean for refugee resettlement, and a lot of issues I've been very interested in. And I guess I was, some of the work I've been doing at a more global level is around how women are not respected as economic actors. And so you could foresee very easily that the economic crisis brought by COVID was going to really send women back to the 50s, which is what it's done in most of Western world. I'm hoping this is something Southeast Asia can avoid to the same extent that it's happening in some of these developed nations, but it's happening everywhere. We've done a lot of survey work around, what is the economic status of women post-COVID, and it's fallen so dramatically. A lot of women just opting out of the workforce. And we've also seen terrible outcomes for creative artists and those in the creative arts. So I guess that's what I've been immediately attracted to. But I also had a lot of personal kind of challenges around, how do you be a good ally to the Black Lives Matters movement while you're in lockdown? Like, how do you stay connected with your human rights communities when you're isolated on your own? How do you keep drawing strength from communities around the world who are trying to make change while you're on your own? It's very hard. All my life I've operated as part of movements, so sort of suddenly trying to be there for your friends and colleagues who are, snatching the moment. For example, in Black Lives Matter, it was like, how do we do this? How do we remain connected in this virtual world? And what does that mean for human rights advocacy? It's really complicated, and I find it difficult. I'm hoping people who are more digital natives than me find it better. But there are some advantages too. There's some amazing scale you can get from this online world. Exactly what Amelia was saying. You can do things more globally. You can find new tribes, you know, to be with and, you know, ally yourself with that you couldn't before. So I'm trying to remain positive, but I really miss being with my people. So yeah, so I'm just devastated for what's happening to everyone around the world. It's just, especially young people, just thinking of all those disruptions to their lives and their education. It is hard not to feel a sense of grief.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's, you know, one of the big challenges, I suppose, looking forwards. You know, if we think about what have been the challenges, you know, what are the challenges when we go into recovery and regeneration in this new period ahead? I mean, one of them is that we simply don't know. We're dealing with a lot of ambiguity and a bit of uncertainty in where things are headed. And I guess, you know, for me, this kind of takes me, I suppose, back to experience. And Ben, maybe I'd like to start with you, actually. You've kind of come from a really interesting background, from sports to, you know, youth mentorship, working with communities around, you know, advocacy and community building. You've been through the cycle of change making a few times too, whether it's at that policy level or the community grassroots level. What actually works when you're looking at uncertainty ahead, but you know that you've got to make change in some area? What actually works? Where were you able to get the most traction when it came to social or policy change? And was it at the top, or was it working with community?
I think it's I think all of us could reflect and just realize that there's not a one size fits all solution. You know, I think I was lured into the illusion that change only happens within when I was younger. So I figured that if I'm going to change something, I need to be at the table, which I think is a false reality. I've come to realize that there's certainly rooms that you have to be at the table at to incite change, but also that short-term provocation from outside can incite the change for those that are within. So I think that's been a really interesting learning for me, you know, now that I'm in my mid-20s. And I think just around this conversation for young people, there's a lot of talk around, you know, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, and, you know, they're the ones that are going to take this world by storm. What I've just learned from my time is that if we can actually build the stage and provide the architecture and just get the heck out of the way, and give, you know, young people the keys and responsibility and the, you know, the keys to the city, then they, you know, will more often than not actually find really wonderful solutions to the complex problems that we're facing. So I think there may be two things that are semi-interesting, and probably the last one that I'd say is I like to know where I stand very early on, and I think the best place to do that is to go to those gatekeepers. If it's institutional change within a university, go to the Vice Chancellor. If you're looking for a multinational corporation to evolve, go to the CEO or the chairperson. If you're looking for policy changes, then, you know, you're better off going to the minister that's in charge of it, so that you can draw a really clear line in the sand and understand where people sit, you know, really early on in the piece. So they're potentially like a couple of learnings over the years, but I guarantee you that I'm at 0.5%, and there's a lot of growing and a lot of learning still to come.
I love that though, Ben. It's so good, because I think as young people, there's often an idea of we can't approach someone, and certainly in some cultural contexts that is actually very much so not part of the norms. It's not encouraged, and it could be seen as disrespectful, you know, not to be following lines of hierarchy.
Yeah.
But it is quite interesting too, because it's quite freeing. One thing that I learned, for instance, from running, you know, 49 events across the region, was that you'd be surprised at just how many people actually want to listen to the voices of young people. And if you can get away with it at any point in time, making your opinions heard, your policy ideas, or your own genius heard, it's when you're young. You know, people are actually going to be listening to you, and they'll probably give you a little bit more freedom to have different thoughts and opinions too.
1,000%. And probably just one final learning is that everyone's looking to be led. You know, we might think that the person in the room has it all together, and often we try and put on this sort of facade that, you know, that oozes of strength and that oozes of certainty. But more often than not, we're all just trying to really figure it out. So, if you are in those rooms or you are dealing with decision makers, just keep in mind that they also are looking to be led, that they're also looking for some train tracks to, put the wheels down on and pursue.
Yeah, and I think I really like that too, because Pin Xiu, you've been in kind of Singapore's parliamentary system, as well as really such a visible and kind of, wonderful advocate for people with disabilities in para-athletics, in across the media, kind of in Parliament, in our national decision making, and all of the rest. For you, I want to hear, what has that been like? Firstly, how have you seen COVID affect the lives of para-athletes and the world of para-athletics? And then secondly, what are you most concerned about for this decade to come? What are you most concerned really needs to change, either at a law kind of or policy, social level?
Okay, the first one first. Yes, there was a lot of questions, but okay, first one. I think para-athletes are also as affected as like able-bodied athletes. The inability to train, the lack of training venues now, and just being confined at home, no competitions, no training camps. So it's really brought an entire year of I would say like maybe some step back in this sport. So like you wouldn't see a year of breaking records and people exceeding themselves, but I think this year I think it's more about coping with the situation, being okay mentally and physically, your safety first, and just everybody trying to go through this entire COVID experience safely together. And then when like after safety, and then we can all like talk about excellence and things like that, but we need to kind of really look at the very basics first, right? So the only difference I can think of when it comes to like para athletes and able-bodied athletes would be that it might affect para athletes a bit more because um like in terms in Singapore, many like I would say like physio was a bit hard to get to, um but that's about it. I think it's really similar. Yeah. Yeah. And what was the second question again? Okay, how I see what I feel should change. So in Singapore particularly, I hope that Singaporeans have a bit more empathy, and we become a Singapore is a country where we are very driven by our academic excellence, by our work excellence, but we're not so much of a sporting nation. But I think that sports can really, really change the world. Sports can help to build resilience. Sports can help you mentally and physically. So I think that we do need to focus a bit more on that as well. But in terms of the entire ASEAN region, I think it's also different. What I hope to see would probably be a bit more yeah, it's still the same, a bit more taught for people who are like the minorities, people who don't have the privilege that some people might have in your country. And I think that as long as you care for somebody else or think for somebody else, not just yourself, it will kind of make society better. And I know the government can enact a lot of change, but very often it starts from the society itself and on the ground. So there needs to be a change in the ground first before people realize that, hey, this is something we must do and start to change as well.
Yeah, I really like that point too, Pin Xiu, because one of the things that I see a lot across Southeast Asia is, if, and actually in Australia too, if there's not many young people in government, which there often isn't, they will go into the creative industries, or they might go into enterprise and doing business or social enterprise. And I think that's one of the great things. I mean, I suppose sometimes we feel like, if only this big corporate would change, or if only this government would change, if only they would do this. But at the end of the day, all these big corporates and governments and all of the rest, they're just individuals. And as much as they can make a change, well, there might be tools that you already have access to that you can make a change. And we've certainly seen that across, fields of arts and kind of the creative industries in starting really amazing, you know, global causes. And as Sue mentioned before, around Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. I mean, if we didn't have the creative industries, we wouldn't be able to share so much about the social and policy change that needed to happen there either. So it's almost about finding, not necessarily, you know, you don't need to be the ambassador in charge, you don't need to be the CEO in charge. You know, there's actually a path and a platform for everyone to be involved in whatever they're passionate about at whatever level that they currently are. So I think that's quite exciting. For you, Sue, though, you've been able to kind of see there at an Outlook, you work across different fields. For you, do you have any tangible policy changes that you'd really like to see in the region or across Australia? Any things that you're really hoping for in this next decade ahead?
Sure. I guess it's interesting. I'd just like to add a couple of things to what Ben said in particular about, you know, there's a real power in the counter narrative. There's power in being the outsider. There's power in being the person who sees the issue differently to everybody else and can express that in a way that is influential. So, you know, the things that often make you fall silent because you don't want to be embarrassed or whatever, they're probably the things that are going to give you power in public debate. So you should embrace that about yourself. If you think you've got a different take on the issue to everybody else, that's great. You know, it's powerful. And I guess the other idea I would say is that things aren't always linear. So a lot of my life I spent on refugee and aid policy, and we had massive achievements and then they unraveled and you have to start again. Women's rights, you know, we gain them and we lose them. I mean, I think there's sayings about women gaining equal pay since the 1970s, and yet it never seems to actually happen. But so, you know, you can't take wins for granted because they can regress really easily. It's always about you know, pushing things. I don't have a wild strategy, you know, a particularly sophisticated strategy. I operate very much on a legacy principle. You know, what is my legacy to this place, this world, my family, my people? You know, what do I want to be remembered for? And a lot of the time you just want to be the person on the right side of history if you possibly can, and you've got to figure out what that means for you, you know. And I love structure. I love architecture reform. I think I know what Ben's saying there. I've often been interested in, you know, what if this part of government? So what if the Office for Women was in fact in Prime Minister and Cabinet instead of out in family services? Would that change the way they see their role? Stuff like that. Stuff that's probably pretty nerdy to most people gets me very excited. Stuff about the way the census data is gathered on gender equality, things like that. Really structural stuff gets me very excited. But you know, I had all sorts of things in my head. I thought, well, I'm not good at economic policy. I can't do economic policy. You need to have an economics degree to do economic policy. Of course you don't. You can't let them get to you with all their mumbo jumbo. You know, you got to just say no. You know, so I managed to talk about gender equality issues in the G20 because I thought it was so important. I was just realizing how important that was to Australia, and there was no gender equality analysis going on of the work we were doing there, and it was driving me crazy. So if you see something that makes you angry, that's a good sign. You know, that's a good. Why isn't anybody doing that? Oh, that would. I should do that.
Yes, Sue, and I want to jump in there because I always, you know, and many young people in the audience, you might often get this question, like, you know, what are you passionate about? Find what you're passionate about and pursue it. And for me, it never worked. Like, I don't know what I'm passionate about. Lots of things I'm interested in, but actually it was the things that I really hated, the things that really got me angry, that was such a much better motivator for change. You know, I was really angry about gender inequality. I was really angry about the racial injustices we're seeing. I was really angry about youth exclusion from kind of our decision making. And so that's kind of been such a much more, a better drive for the policy change that I wanted, or just the life I wanted to live. So yeah.
I think that's right. You can be a professional proposition or policy advocate, but still be heavily motivated by rage about injustice. You know, you just smile and get it done, you know. But yeah, rage is useful, you know.
It certainly is. And thank you for bringing up legacy too, because I promise I'm going to go to audience questions soon, because I've got a piling up. Please keep typing them in, either in the chat or in the Q&A function. Pin Xiu, I want to hear from you. What is your legacy? What would you like to leave? You know, what would you like to be able to say, hey, I went out there in the world and this was the change that I was able to make or inspire?
For me, I don't want to just have words that come up from my mouth. I want to actually take action to do it. So I do want to be known as a Paralympian. So I want to finish Paris and then hopefully retire after that. I know it feels like a long time, but 3 years is actually flies by really quickly. And then I definitely want to stay in the sports industry, give back in the sports industry, hopefully work in a bit of more inclusion when it comes to sports for all abilities and all ages.
Yeah, cool. And I think you've already made such great headway into that legacy. Ben, I'm going to come to you too. For you, what would you really like to have been able to see or be witness to after kind of the end of this all? What would you really like to have seen the change made? If Ben is there.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi in quarantine.
Sorry.
The question was, what's the legacy that I would like
to... or the change you would have liked to have seen maybe start or provoked off something that you were involved in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really keen in improving the human condition. And I think what Sue spoke about before is just bringing a high level of dignity to people's lives. Is there like a staple thing that people are going to remember me for? Maybe. But I'm also just really interested in, and I think it's maybe my nature and where my skills lie, but, you know, leaving behind a bunch of things that people actually can't map back to me. I think that I am very good at being the second person or the person behind the person. And I think that gives me maybe more opportunity to have my hand in a multiplistic, in a number of different things. So I also like Banksy a lot and love that no one knows who Banksy is. And yeah, if I can just go about my business, not center myself as, you know, not fill up space, but rather just devote time to things that matter, then I know that I'm going to live an abundantly full and rich life.
And the reason why I ask this question is because when we're looking, and I know Sue and I do a lot of work around this, but when we're looking at government or when we're looking at organizations or any community group or anything out there, we often are thinking about solving problems here and now, right where we are. But one thing we often don't do is kind of legacy test. Well, how would that policy or that decision or that idea stand up to the longevity of time? So it's always interesting, because as soon as you look at it through that lens, you think, oh gosh, maybe that isn't the best choice that we could make right now. And there's a better way we could go about this. Yeah,
it's interesting. I just kind of reflect when you say that, Elise, on just Aboriginal culture, right? That's been here since the first human sunrise, and has invested in this country forever and a day. In a manner that is designed to ensure that it can continue to last for forever and a day. So I think there's some interesting things that, you know, when we think of practical changes, how we can potentially move away from, how we can move away from, you know, economic measurements of gross domestic product, because it doesn't actually encourage, you know, things like, you know, thinking of 5, 10, 15 years ahead, let alone thinking about forever. So it's an interesting point, you know, is there a forever economy that exists? You know, are there ways that we can bring more dignity, you know, more empathy, more kindness to the world that we live in, and also the systems that we participate in?
I love that too, that you raised it, because I was just having a conversation with an amazing human rights activist in Cambodia last week, and he was talking about moving away from measuring a country's output by GDP, so gross domestic product, kind of our economic way of measuring things and how much worth is a human, to actually looking at, well, how happy are we? You know, what's our well-being? What's our quality of life? More to the point, and to be able to dig into that. And you know, it always reminds me, working across the region, if we're talking about something like climate change, or we're talking about you know, war and conflict resolution, it always helps me to actually step outside and think about, well, okay, how would these things affect a transgender woman in the Pacific, or a blind Iranian man, you know, who's currently living in South Asia, or, you know, and taking and trying to actually step outside your own experience of things, because I think it can be also really difficult sometimes or it can be easy to dissociate from certain issues and not actually realize that actually we have to think a bit more complexly about the world and the issues in it. On that, I'm going to head to some of the audience questions, and I see one really lovely one from Ashley that I want to read out to our panelists. And Amelia, feel free to join in at any point too. I know you have some awesome opinions too, having also come through this, being someone who's young and engaged in the world. But Ashley asks, I've seen many teens become exhausted and averse to thinking about international issues, tending to retreat into binge watching and TikTok. I feel you. Like many adults. In your opinion, what can we do to re-inspire a COVID-weary population of young people to care again and to take an interest? I'm really interested in this. I'm going to throw this. Is there any one of you who might be most interested in answering this one first? Ben, I see you.
Oh, I think that we don't know the impact of technology, right? Like, this is an ongoing human experiment where we haven't had, you know, a long enough time to truly assess, you know, the positives and the detrimental impacts of it. But I would just say that there's a woman, Alexis Wright, who's an amazing Aboriginal woman from the Gulf of Carpentaria. She's one of the best writers that the country has, but she talks about this concept of sovereignty of mind, which is the ability to eliminate, you know, all of the noise pollution, all of the things that seem to, you know, pollute our psyche, and it's an avalanche. So I just encourage people that are tired, that are fatigued, to rest first and foremost. And if you're in the change space, you know, don't burn out, because so many people have entered it and left it feeling really jaded about themselves and the world that that we live in. But yeah, just to take the time to pause. And if you can, eliminate as many distractions as possible and try and tune into those moments of sovereignty within the mind.
Love that, sovereignty in the mind. Sue, do you have any thoughts?
I have exhausted
You've got
cynical
thoughts.
teens of my own. And I also get exhausted and cynical. For me, it's just about getting back into nature and, you know, dragging them out for a bushwalk, or looking at the stars, or just something that gives you a sense of scale. And it's beautiful. But I must admit, I solve a lot of my problems by watching many videos of adorable animals. It's terrible. Like, I'm on We Rate Dogs every day. So there's nothing wrong with seeking solace from things. It's just, you know, when are you the master, and when are you the slave to your tech, you know? And it's a real thing to become addicted. You can become addicted to almost anything. So you have to really watch, is this making me happy? Is this making me more effective as a person? Is all I am cynical? What am I doing that is positive? You know, President Trump had a big impact on my kids. They really turned them off politics in lots of different ways. Couldn't believe how someone could behave like that, and be still president and remain president. And there's not a lot you can do. Sometimes kids are just a bit more honest about what's going in the world. They've all done the climate marches. They do the schools protests for climate marches. They got involved in Black Lives Matter marches as allies. And you know, I love seeing them just getting out there and you know, being a good ally. We talk about that a lot. But I get it. I understand why there's a lot of mental health issues in our community, and especially for young people. And just think it's something we should all take more seriously. You know, I'm watching our students at university really start looking grim. Yeah.
That's a good point. And so, Pin Xiu, because I know that with you, you've been working really hard for advocacy and inclusion for a long time, alongside maintaining a professional career in sports, alongside your stints in Parliament too, and whatever else you did in the world. Like, I imagine that you're a professional at this. You know, what do you think? How do people look after themselves? How can young people reinvigorate themselves for the things that they care about?
I've definitely gotten jaded before, especially when you work so hard for something, but you want it to change, but it just doesn't go your way. So what really helps me is talking to people who also have the same ideas as me, so we kind of can bounce things off each other, work together. But of course, as Ben said, like, rest is really important, and it's no shame to rest. Just you need to take some time for yourself. You need to care for yourself before you can help anybody else. But then again, I think we do need to move along with technology and society. So this TikTok thing might not necessarily be a bad thing if you fall into the right TikTok, right? So I've seen like sustainability, like people sharing sustainability stuff on TikTok, or like their Black Lives Matter, or the dance. Not so much the dancers, but really it's, if on the sustainability one, it's really teaching you how to lead a no waste lifestyle, which I think is really cool, and there are definitely things to learn from there as well, as long as you follow the right TikTok.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. We also have a question here from Jack, and I'm going to direct this to you first, Pin Xiu, because I know that you have to actually duck out a little bit early from our session today. So even if you disappear in the midst of this, we're very thankful for your time tonight. But Jack asks, well, he says, this is an exciting time for reevaluating equitable service. Both Pin Xiu and Ben and Sue have talked about this. But the exposure of these vulnerabilities also provides opportunities for exploitation. How can we hold our regional neighbours and our own governments accountable during this moment when it comes to, I guess, equality and inclusion? What do you think, Pin Xiu?
When it comes to equality and inclusion, I think that people are realizing that they need to work on it, because more and more with technology, we can also see that more and more things are not equal or not inclusive. So there is awareness now, but what needs to change is really taking into consideration that this is actually should be on a priority list somewhere. It should be on top and not so at the bottom of the list already, because all of these things matter to people, and like it's human dignity and living a good life, the life that we want. So it's important to start working on it now, and I think that governments are slowly starting to see that as well. Slowly but surely.
Sure. And what about you, Sue? Because you have had a lot of experience working with different governments all across the world. What's worked when it's come to saying, hey, this is important, we need to actually take note of this and better do something about it? And your mic is muted right now.
That's all. Great pause. Look, data sometimes helps, being able to send a narrative that's got data. So for a lot of gender issues, we heavily rely on saying, this is what you say, but the actual lives of women and girls in your country looks like this, and we can prove it. So again, it's that kind of counter narrative, evidence-based counter narrative to what countries say as to what they do. But, you know, I think this idea of making countries accountable against regression, you know, so saying you've increased the rights of the people in your, or ended poverty to a certain extent for so many people in your country, your region. Don't let that go. Don't let that backslide. You know, just trying to keep making the case that where states have made progress, you just keep reinforcing that they don't want to lose that progress that they've made around girls' education or around, the rights of migrant workers or whatever it is. But I think we have to hold this. We have to hold people accountable during these moments, because these are exactly the moments when, as our colleagues have said, that the inequalities will become more sticky, more obvious, more deep. This is exactly the time. Any type of transitional crisis moment is exactly the time where you have to go harder in your advocacy, go louder in your advocacy, and keep backing it up with evidence that you can get.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of, years ago when I studied journalism, and we learned about, what makes something news. And there's a lot of elements to something being timely, and being actually able to capitalize on a moment where, whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's, something else, climate strikes, and be able to use that time to further your policy push, your narrative, whatever it is, maybe to be able to raise an issue that you've been sitting on for years and not had the courage to bring up. That can sometimes be your in. And so it's kind of looking for those, points in time which you can use to leverage, as well as other things. So yeah, that's a good point. I also have another question for the panel, and that's, what's one positive thing that you've seen come out of the pandemic? And can I get anyone to kick me off?
Yeah, I might jump into that, but just back to Jack's question really quickly, because I just think it's a really great question, and something that I'm so cognizant of, that our economies are highly exploitive, full stop. And what we're seeing in this time of crisis is that whole notion of shock capitalism, or that doctrine of shock capitalism, where corporations are cognizantly cashing in on the chaos around us. So my thing that I'm really concerned about here in Australia is that, when we think about the high levels of debt at a state and federal level, and also the balance sheets of corporate entities, that, each of those parties are going to want to push through really callous like economic development to balance out, those sheets. Why I think two things for this next decade that are really important, is not only moving away from GDP as that core metric of our, of social success, but also moving towards the notions of sovereignty and treaty making with First Nations people, not only here in Australia, but across this whole ASEAN region. So, and then probably finally to that, Jack, is how do we just take whatever power that we've got, implement any power that we've got, whether that's through consumption, whether that's through the brands that we support, whether that's through the people that we follow, whether it's through the events we attend. How can we not wait, for those institutions which currently I think are devoid of, all sorts of authentic leadership. Instead of waiting for them, how can we force the issue by taking power back into our own hands?
And such a good point around kind of greenwashing or any other thing that we might see. So this idea that, if we care about the environment, and companies or governments might say, yes, we're doing all this wonderful work, but they might not necessarily be doing it. And I think it comes back to having critical thought and being able to develop that in yourself, being able to ask the question why, and why, and why, and why, and why, to get to the root of why someone is doing something or acting in a certain way. And are their intentions genuine? And if it's not quite matching up to what they say they're doing, well, how can you, work to try and maybe flip what they are doing to make it genuine and real, and I know we're seeing a little bit of a call out culture in that way too, but how can we actually ensure that people are living up to the promises that they're making? Yeah. I'll go back to one of the questions. And Pin Xiu, sorry, did you want to say something before we have to head off?
I think one of the good things that came out from this pandemic really is, with technology, it helps makes a lot of things more accessible to people. Previously, if you couldn't leave your house, now you can work from home. They recognize the fact that you don't have to be physically present. Sometimes, like this is happening, even though we are so far apart, instead of me having to fly to somewhere, which I used to have to do. And I think people are also spending a lot more time at home, which might be good or not, but good for some people, where you can start to build that better relationships with your family, especially since you have no choice. Yeah.
Totally. That's a good point. And actually, I really love it. You know, this is this COVID period has also been a time where, you know, all of the, I guess, incremental changes that maybe gender advocates or disability advocates have been wanting for years, you know, special sorts of, you know, supports in order to make things more accessible or easier to do or whatever it might be. All of a sudden they're all possible. And so it wasn't really ever about the fact that they weren't possible. It was just a lack of will. And so it's exposing some of those. And I think paving a pathway to perhaps some things that we might definitely keep beyond that. What about you, Sue? A positive thing that you've seen emerge out of the pandemic?
I just put it in the chat. I'm just stoked about people's ideas of being an essential worker. Have really.
Oh, sorry, the sound has gone again.
Don't know why. Is that better?
That's better.
I shall shout at you. I just think our idea of who is an essential worker will always be different. You know, we'll look at people, nurses and people who work at grocery stores and, you know, people who work in aged care. They are essential workers, and, you know, the fancy person in the management corporation might not be so useful. You know, like I'm hoping our sense of who is valued as a worker has changed forever. I hope. And I hope that leads to, you know, more equitable kind of salaries and things like that in the future. But I also, and this is I feel a bit guilty about this, but I do like seeing, you know, kind of comfy middle class Australians understanding what it's like when government messes around with you and shuts the border and moves you from one place to another, and, you know, suddenly you've lost your job and it's not your fault. You know, that I'm hoping that breeds some empathy. You know, this happens to a whole lot of people all the time, and, you know, it's not their fault either, right? So I think it's this kind of sense of maybe we can become more equitable and forgiving about, you know, people's situations in life. And I hope, I mean, I know you shouldn't want Australia to go through a pandemic to learn some empathy, but I'm really hoping we did, hey? Yeah.
Completely. Ben, do you have anything to add?
I think they're really great insights, Sue, particularly on, you know, how do we weight people's importance within the economy, within the marketplace? You know, it's really just turned the notion of who's important upside down and given us real perspective. And I hope that maintains, you know, leading into the future. I'd say like maybe an intangible one is that we've just been forced to slow down and, you know, get off the production line and moving at 1,000 miles an hour without much intention. So I hope that people over this time of, you know, of lockdown and of less movement have just had the chance to maybe, you know, acquaint themselves perhaps for the first time with themselves as individuals, and to get comfortable with things like boredom, you know, to pick up hobbies that, you know, they may have had when they were kids, you know, to unlock joy or to flex different muscles. So I think there's some intangible things that will come from it. And, you know, my hope is that we don't go back to moving at 1,000 miles an hour, but we can live with, you know, much more empathy and a much higher level of intention.
Completely. Okay. And I suppose this kind of feeds into some of the things that, you know, some of the final questions, and I don't think we're going to get time to get through to them all. But I do really want to have your opinions on this. A participant asks, to all the panelists, what do you hope policymakers will focus on this year? What short-term change would you like to see? And I think this kind of goes to some of those really tangible immediate steps. And the second one is around, what do you think is a solution to inequality on the internet? And I think that's a really interesting question, and actually not one that I've considered. So I might let panelists think about it a bit. Is there anyone who wants to kick that off though? Perhaps Sue, I see your mic is available, or Ben.
Yeah, I think I've never heard a question around inequality on the internet, but I think that is a byproduct of potential talent hoarding. And I think that we've allowed lots of industries and lots of companies to have a monopoly on talent, and that we haven't actually been able to have an equitable depository of talent across all the different sectors. So I don't know if that's useful, but I just think that if we had our best engineers, our best data scientists working on, more important things rather than how can we force people to consume or engage with certain content, then we might have some more equitable solutions. So that's something that I'm interested in, is how we can have a better spread of, talent across the marketplace.
Yeah, completely.
I guess my take on this is that the internet's still not a very safe place for women and girls around the world, and people of sexual diversity generally. There's still a huge amount of harassment and various other issues that go on the web. So and bias in algorithms against people of colour and gender bias. So the internet should be a place of freedom. It should be a place of anonymous identity. It should be a place where you can be and no one can see what you are, which is good and bad in some ways. But what you find is that the internet becomes another way to experience violence and intimidation and discrimination. And we've got to catch up. All our laws, and international law in particular, is sort of 50 years behind where the internet is now. And I guess I'm always incredibly worried about access to technology generally, and that's another thing during COVID. Students who had access to data and computers and space versus those who didn't, people in countries that didn't have access to be able to work online. What happens, the whole industries that transform to become digital, leaving a whole lot of people behind. So there's always winners and losers with tech. Tech is always always a double-edged sword. I'm just hearing all this stuff. Technology will save us from climate change impacts. I'm like, oh, really? No. No. It won't, Prime Minister. It's only a tool. It's never a solution on its own. Big red button doesn't fix everything. So yeah, but I'm aware. I'm a Burma researcher. I'm aware what the lack of access to internet is doing for my colleagues in Myanmar on such a range of issues since the coup. So I think it's there are lots of problems with technology, but when it's suddenly taken away from you, I sense that it's a horrible shock to a whole range of people's livelihoods.
Of course, and I wish we had more time to go into many of these topics. But I'm going to leave our panelists on a final question. And Amelia, I would absolutely love it if you felt comfortable in answering this one too. But what is one piece of advice you would tell your younger self? If you could go back and say, focus on this, don't do that, do this. Let's hear it. For our young people in the audience, what should they be keeping their eye out for, or perhaps committing themselves to?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick that one off if you'd like, Elise. Piece of advice that I would give to my younger self would be to focus more closely on learning a language. I think that that knowing a language is knowing a culture, and you can't demonstrate your interest as closely in another country or another culture without being able to have that way of communicating, or at least being able to demonstrate that you want to have that way of communicating. When I started, so I was studying international relations, and I was not doing a language as part of my degree. And in the final semester of university, of my degree, I picked up a language. And that has shaped everything that I've done since then. It shaped the entire trajectory of what I saw my career being, and I'm eternally grateful for, really actually quite a number of happy coincidences that led to me making that decision. Stars aligning and being on an exchange program where Indonesian was taught at the university, and I went, oh yeah, of course I'll enroll in Indonesian. That seems like I'd love to learn more about Southeast Asia. I'm here in the States, but I want to know what's going on closer to home, enrolled in Indonesian. And then it wasn't until a year or so later, and I went, why was I able to enroll in Indonesian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US? Like, why was I able to do that? And I looked it up, and it was one of 6 universities across the States where it was taught. So that's a long-winded way of saying that would be my piece of advice, to embrace studying another language.
Love that. Great advice too. Thanks, Amelia. Sue, can I get some advice from you?
Sure. I used to try really hard to not tell everyone where I was from or show my background, and now I tell everybody. But also I would say stuff like, well, I suppose, you know, your curiosity might send everyone around you mad, but it'll really pay off one day. And guess what? You don't have to go overseas to be a human rights activist. My God, stay where you are and deal with injustice where you are. And then the other thing I'd say is, you're going to spend most of your life learning about the feminist movement, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to unlearn how to be a white feminist and be a feminist who's an ally to people of colour. Like, it's just this kind of, you have to keep going, you know, you have to keep pushing yourself and up here to unlearn things as well. Yeah, it's not always about learning. Sometimes it's about unlearning.
I love that. Learn and unlearn. What about you, Ben?
Yeah, geez, there's so many unsolicited things that I could say in this moment.
Great.
Yeah, I think like maybe one thing early on, and we often hear about talking, you know, surrounding yourself with like-minded people. I think that's really healthy, but it's also dangerous if it's not done intentionally. So I think for my younger self, what I would have done is, or a piece of advice that I'd put in the time machine and go back to implement, would just engage a lot more compassionately with the marketplace of ideas. There's, you know, and perhaps not spend as much time drinking your own bathwater, meaning that engaging with the same people that are looking at the world in the same way that you are. For those in Australia, I think I've got, you know, more to learn from Pauline Hanson, you know, than perhaps from, I don't know who I can use as who I can equate her to, but there's a lot to learn from people that, you know, are seeing things differently, and to just as best as possible, try and engage with that compassionately and with empathy.
Really, really sound advice. And I think for me, if I get kind of facilitator's rights to end with my own piece of advice, it would be, you know,
bring it home.
Good. Thank you. That's the permission needed. Look, for me, I'm going to say that if you're looking out there and you think, hey, I'd really like to make change in this sort of area, or do this sort of career, or, you know, whatever crazy dream you're thinking of, but it doesn't exist, create it yourself. You actually have that power, and it's actually phenomenal. You know, you don't need that much to be able to start up whatever it is. If it's an idea, it's an organization, it's an enterprise, it's a policy change idea. You know, there's small ways you can start. And, you know, I'm very lucky today to be sitting here, you know, as one of the curators of this speaker series. But this all started because maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote a blog and I said, I believe that young people need to be included in our foreign policy more. And here I am today, getting to be able to kind of share this platform with all these amazing people and yourselves, audience, viewers, to be able to actually share and collaborate and talk over these issues and be part of our foreign policy across the region. So it can be small steps, and you can find a place that you're comfortable with, that suits your personality, that suits your skill sets and suits your interests, and pursue that, create it if it doesn't exist. But on that note, it looks like I have run out of time, and I'm so grateful to everyone for turning up here today to kick off Next Gen Policy Change, our week of events for change makers, for young people, for people all across the age spectrum, and for all those across different interests and kind of passions in our community here in Australia, as well as the region. We have 4 more events this week. Tomorrow at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, then Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, all kicking off at 6 p.m. please be part. Join us again. We're going to be going through everything from how do you actually start up like the tangible elements of making social or policy change, right through to design thinking, policy entrepreneurship, and essentially what are some of the great stories from the region and the people who are out there pioneering change themselves. I want to say a massive thanks to our panelists tonight, Yip Pin Xiu, Ben and Amelia, for their generous time, and to all of our audience for being here. Keep the conversations going. Definitely turn up to our other events, but there are other ways to be involved, and you can look us up, Policy Innovation Hub, Griffith Business School, or you can reach out to the Young Entrepreneurs and Leaders Speaker Series on Facebook or any other platform. Thank you for being part. I wish you the best in your policy and social change lives going forwards. And thanks again for being here this evening.
Thanks, team.
Bye.